We were talking this morning in our Sunday school class about persecution a little bit during World War II, especially during the 1930s and the early 1940s during World War II. And what in particular, we were talking about an individual named Corrie ten Boom. Corrie ten Boom was from, I think, Belgium, up in that region. And she and her family were put in prison for hiding Jews from the Nazis. And as a result, the Nazis found out about her and her family, and so they arrested her and put them in concentration camps. And as a result, during that time in the concentration camps, Corrie's family, her dad and her sisters, didn't make it. Her siblings didn't make it in the concentration camps. But there was a time during that when Corrie was in the concentration camp that she was in despair at what to do and what was going to happen. Well, what's going to happen? And she was towards the end of the war, and her sister and her family hadn't made it at that point. And then she, through a clerical error, she was miraculously released before the end of the war. And so she was able to go free and be able to live out her life. And the reality is that she was a strong believer in her faith in Jesus Christ. She was one who believed that God could deliver even in the midst of great difficulties and great trials. There was a quote that she had said that said, "There is no pit that is so deep that God is not yet deeper still." That's a phenomenal quote, but the reality of the truth, that the truth is there. There is no pit that is so deep that God is not yet deeper still. And she was probably in the deepest pit that anyone could be a part of. And the reality was that God ended up using her. She ended up writing a book called The Hiding Place. There was a movie made about that. And God ended up using her in her latter years after the war, and she was a strong Christian, and she developed a ministry, and she wrote about her experiences and her struggles and her difficulties during that time. And then also God used her to be able to share the gospel as well. So she trusted God, she believed God during the time of great difficulty, and God delivered her. Now think about your own life. I know that some of us have not gone through something such as what Corrie ten Boom has gone through, but I'm sure some of us have gone through difficulties or persecution or hardships at the hands of others, where others have come against us, or said things against us, or done things against us that have really hurt us, that have really affected us because of our faith, or because of things that we have done, and it wasn't any fault of our own. And the reality is that, well, what do you do in times of those troubles? What did you do when you were facing those difficulties? What did you do when you were facing those struggles? And the reality is that, did you call upon God in those times? And as you called upon God, did you find His strength and His ability to be sufficient for you in your life in those difficult times? Did you call out to Him and cry out to Him and find His strength and His peace that comes from when He delivers you? Now, we're going to look at the Apostle Paul today, and how Paul Paul was in Jerusalem, and Paul was facing trial, he was facing arrest, he was facing great difficulties. And he was facing false accusations and false things that people were saying against him, and which therefore led to him being persecuted. But we also see how Paul trusted in his God, and how God delivered him, and how God took care of him even in the midst of those trials and those difficulties. And so we see here that that we're going to find out that how Paul, what was the secret of Paul getting delivered at the hands of those who would seek to harm him. And we're going to look at that this morning in a wonderful way. We're going to look at Acts chapter 21, verses 27 to 40. And we're going to look at three specific points here. We're going to look at the accusations and the reasons. We're going to look at the provocation and the persecution. And then we're going to look at the deliverance and the witness. Let's look at verses 27 to 29. And I'm going to read along here. I'm going to read verses 27 and 29. It says, "When the 7 days were almost over, the Jews from Asia, upon seeing him in the temple, began to stir up all the crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, 'Men of Israel, come out to our aid. This is the man who preaches to all men everywhere against our people and the law and this place. And besides, he has even brought Greeks into the temple, and he has defiled this holy place.' For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with him, and they supposed that Paul had brought him to the temple." In verse 27, it's when the 7 days were almost over. In other words, as we were talking about last week, Paul had made a vow. And the vow consisted of him doing certain ceremonial rites for 7 days. So that's what they're referring to. Referring to Paul completing his vow that he had made. And it says here that the Jews, seeing him in the temple, began to stir up the crowd and lay their hands on him, just for seeing him in the temple. So here were these Jewish rebel-rousers that were trying to hurt Paul. They see Paul in the temple. Now they see him there, and as a result they automatically, what do? Just because they saw him in the temple, automatically what do? So they get other people. They get other people involved. They get other people, and what do they start doing? They start arousing and started causing trouble with other people. They started making a racket. They started making noise. They started making Paul out to be something that he's really not. So they started stirring up the trouble. And so the reality is that they were provocating, or they were provoking these others to get against Paul. And often that's what people do, don't they? Is that if they don't like you, or if they have something against you, or if there's something that's in their hearts against you, what's going to happen? They're not only going to try and do something against you, but they're also going to try and do what? They're also going to try and provoke others against you. And so the reality is that they're not satisfied with their own selves against you, but they're all going to try and get as many people as they can in order to come against you. And so that often happens. I've seen it happen as well. And I've seen that where that persecution can happen. Where I was in Romania, I heard stories of individuals who were put in prison at the hands of their own family members, because they turned themselves into the communist leaders at that time. This was under the communist rule in Romania at that time, and all family members would get other people, and they would turn their own family members in against the government, and their family members would be put in prison. So that's often happens is people, they don't like you or they have something against you, even family members can even hurt you and get other people involved. And the accusations may not even be true. All they are just accusations with no evidence or no substance to those things. It says here, in verse 28, it says, crying out, "Men of Israel, this is the man who preaches to all men everywhere against our people, the law, and the temple." They're trying to stir up negative reputation on Paul. See here, and now as we're going to find out, these were Jews from Asia. Where was Paul preaching? Asia. Where was he doing his missionary journeys? A lot of it was in Asia. And so these Jewish folks were there, and that they were trying to stir up Paul and say things that maybe weren't necessarily true. Well, he's trying to stir up people against our nation, our law, this temple. See what he's trying to do? You see him? See what he's trying to do? And that's what people do, don't they? They say, you see what they're doing? See what they're doing? Come on along with me. And the accusations may not even be true. See, they were just angry that Paul was preaching the gospel. And that's the same thing the way it was with Jesus, wasn't it? But that they were trying to stir up the crowd, especially when he was standing before Pilate. What were they trying to do? They were saying, the leaders, the religious leaders were trying to do what? To the other people, saying, come on, Jesus, get Jesus. He did this, and they were stirring up the crowd. But they were saying things that were false and that weren't true, that had no basis. But they were looking for something in order to have an accusation. And sometimes that is not necessarily true. And that sometimes ends up what happens with us or with others, where they try and say something against us and get others against us based on something that is not true. And so in verse 29, and this is a supposition, it says, and they supposed that Trophimus the Ephesian was brought into the temple by Paul after seeing Paul in the city. This is big. They're ready to kill Paul with no real evidence, just a supposition. They suppose Trophimus was a Greek. He wasn't a Jew. And according to the Jewish law, is that you could not have a non-Jew come into the temple or the temple area. So they suppose that this gentleman who was with Paul in the city of Jerusalem at that time they assumed, because they saw Paul in the temple, they assumed that Trophimus was with Paul in the temple. And so therefore, that would have been blasphemy, and that would have been therefore reason for murder. I mean, reason to kill Paul or to stone him to death, or to have him taken out. And so again, it's all based on something that they suppose happened, but they didn't really know had happened. And often that's the way it is. People suppose things. People suppose things that are not necessarily true. I'll give you an example. Like with King Saul, with David. He supposed a lot of things about David that weren't true. He supposed that David was not loyal to him. He supposed that King Saul supposed that David was trying to hurt him. All of those accusations are not true. And so therefore, based on his suppositions, what was Saul trying to do? Saul was trying to kill David. He was trying to take out David. Whereas David was probably the most loyal, most dedicated person there was. And the reality is that whenever people do things, it's often based on supposition where there's no real evidence. And there's no real basis for what they're trying to do. Let's go on here. And it goes on, and secondly it says the provocation and the persecution. Let's look at 30 and 31. Then all the city was provoked, and the people rushed together, and taking hold of Paul, they dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. While they were seeking to kill him, a report came up to the commander of the Roman cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. So the reality is that all the city was provoked. If you look at verse 30, provoked by what? Provoked by accusations and suppositions that weren't necessarily true. What does it lead to? The whole city was in an uproar. With Jesus, the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar based on suppositions and accusations that people made that have no real basis. Trying to destroy, like with Jesus, trying to destroy the temple, trying to lead a rebellion against the Roman government, which were absolutely not true and had no basis for it, but which was a lie. It had no truth to it. And often that's what happens when people say things or do things against us. It's often based on accusations and suppositions that don't have any basis to it. And what does it lead to? It can lead to where people can get really hurt. And so here, the whole city was, to get all these people in an uproar. Remember, the whole city of Jerusalem at that time was in an uproar because of these people aroused everybody. They roused the whole city at that time against Paul because of what was going on. And it says the people rushed together, and listen to what happened in verse 31. So the people rushed together, took hold of Paul, dragged him out of the temple, shut the door, seeking to kill him and beating him. So these accusations and these suppositions led to what? They grabbed Paul, they get a hold of him, and they're seeking to do what? Seeking to kill him, and they were beating him. So their whole purpose was to do what? To get rid of Paul, to drag Paul out of the city, and to take him and to harm him and take him out of the way, just so that they can get their agenda done. They didn't like what Paul represented. They didn't like what Paul said. They didn't like what Paul was doing. And so therefore, they'll arouse other people to accomplish and fulfill their agenda, which was to take the person out. The religious leaders were trying to do what with Jesus? They were trying to arouse the people to do what? To kill and to take Jesus out so they could accomplish their agenda and their purpose. And that's what people do. And what people do with us is that people seek to hurt us or seek to harm us or seek to do things to us in order to accomplish their agenda. And they're not concerned necessarily about what happens to us. Matter of fact, they want to hurt us. But the reality is that all they want to do is they want to accomplish their agenda, and they want to do what they want to do in order to make sure that they receive and they do what they have purposed in their heart, which was, well, I'm going to hurt this person, I'm going to get you out, I'm going to take care of you. So listen to this. And lastly, it says the deliverance and the witness. It says, this is verses 33 through 40. It says, then the commander came up and took hold of him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. And he began asking who he was and what he had done. But among the crowd, some were shouting one thing and some another. And when he could not find out the facts because of the uproar, he ordered him to be brought into the barracks. When he got to the stairs, he was carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob. For the multitude of the people kept following him, shouting, away with him. As Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the commander, may I say something to you? And he said, do you know Greek? Then you are not the Egyptian who sometime stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness. But Paul said, I am a Jew of Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of the no insignificant city. And I beg you allow me to speak to the people. And when he had given him permission, Paul, standing on the stairs, motioned to the people with his hand. And when there was a great hush, he spoke to them in the Hebrew dialect, saying, verse 31, it says, a report came to the commander of the Roman cohort. And a Roman cohort was a commander that was in charge of 1,000 troops. So here was a pretty high commander. And he was stationed in Jerusalem at the time. And if you know the Romans were a world dynasty. They were world ruler for over 400 years because they were well organized. Their soldiers were well positioned. Their commanders knew what they were supposed to do, and they accomplished that with brutality. But they accomplished what they wanted to accomplish. But they were under orders. So this commander was seeing an uproar going on in the city. So what does he do? If he's a commander, he wants to do what in the city? He wants to keep peace. So he sees the whole city in an uproar. So what does he do? He goes and he sends some soldiers and centurions, and he goes down to Paul. And immediately, soon as the people see these soldiers, the commander and these soldiers, what do? Look at that verse 31. What did they stop doing? They stopped beating who? Paul. At that moment. So what did God do at that moment? What did God do? God sent the form of a deliverer to who? To Paul in the midst of that moment. in the form of the commander, of the Roman commander here. And so the commander, even though God will sometimes send a deliverer, but the deliverer may not always be what we expect him to be. And it may come in the form and shape that we may not expect it to be. But here was the commander. And the commander was the only one who could make the deliverance for Paul at that moment and at that time. And so the reality is that the commander was there to do what? He didn't even realize it, but the commander was sent by the Lord to do what? To bring peace. He was thinking he'd bring peace to the city, but the commander was there what? To bring deliverance to Paul. Because what happened? Paul had a purpose and a mission. And what was that purpose and the mission to do? Was to go to not only Jerusalem where he was, but also to go to Rome and preach the gospel. So if they were going to kill Paul, Paul wouldn't have been able to fulfill or accomplish his purpose that God had called him to do. So God sent the deliverer in the form of the commander. In verse 32, he took some soldiers and centurions and ran down to Paul. He just didn't casually walk down. Hey, Paul. What did he do? What he did is that he ran down, his soldiers ran down to Paul because Paul was being what? Paul was being beaten to death. He was trying to be beaten to death. And that's what they were trying to do. And it says, in verse 33, it says, the commander took hold of Paul and bound him with chains, supposing him to be a criminal. But the reality was he wanted to save Paul so that Paul wouldn't be killed. But his misunderstanding was he was thinking that Paul was a leader of a rebellion. And that's what was causing all these people, the whole city, to be in an uproar. The commander was thinking, well, this Paul is the one who's leading a rebellion, and that's what's causing the city to be in an uproar. But he didn't realize, the commander didn't realize that it was the Jewish leaders that were causing the whole city to be in an uproar. The commander didn't realize and understand that, but nonetheless, the commander took Paul, he bound him, and Paul was safe for the moment there. But there was a misunderstanding, and often that's what happens, is that people are under the misunderstanding that here is a man, Paul, who's causing all the trouble, when in reality it's someone else. But the truth is going to come out, and the truth always comes out. And he asked the crowd who Paul was and what he had done. Well, listen to this. That was verse 33. It says, they couldn't, in verse 34, they couldn't ascertain because of the uproar of the crowd. So the crowd was so loud, the crowd was so boisterous, the crowd was making such a ruckus. What they did was they couldn't ascertain the truth. They were asking the crowd, saying, hey, what's going on here? What's happening here? What's going on? But they couldn't because everybody was yelling and there was such a riot going on that they couldn't get to the truth. So what did they do? In verse 34 it says, they ordered Paul to be brought back to the barracks where there was safety. So they bring Paul back to the barracks where they could find out the truth. They see Paul, they saw the crowd was trying to beat Paul, they're trying to get Paul, and they were trying to take Paul out. So what did they do? They bring Paul to what? To safety. Back to the barracks. And it says, as they were trying to take Paul back to the barracks, let's look at verses 35 and 36. It says, Paul was carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowds. And verse 36, they kept following them, saying, away with him. So the soldiers were doing what? They were carried by the soldiers. So the soldiers were the ones who were protecting Paul. Because the people were still doing what? Even though the soldiers were there, the people were still trying to get to Paul and trying to do what to Paul? They were trying to kill him and trying to hurt him and harm him in some way. But what was God doing? God was continuing what? To protect Paul. To provide for Paul even in the midst of the difficulties. Even in the midst of what someone else was trying to do to hurt them. And that's often what happens. When we're in the midst of a difficulty, when we're in the midst of a trial, we're in the midst of a struggle, what will God do? When someone is seeking to harm us, or someone is seeking to hurt us, or saying hurtful things against us, or trying to do things against us that are going to harm us in some way. what will God do? God will send a deliverer. I think of a song where it talks about my deliverer, where God is the one who ultimately delivers. Your Psalms, if you look at the book of Psalms, there's often Psalms about deliverance. Look at Psalm 140, 142. It talks about, and many other Psalms are all talking about Psalms of deliverance, where God is the one who sends deliver. God is the one who cry out, and God is the one who does what? He delivers. I think of a scripture in Psalm 46:1. The Lord is my refuge and strength, and ever-present help in trouble. Psalm 18:10. The Lord, Proverbs 18:10. The Lord is. Let me read that. The Lord is my strong deliverer, and it talks about how God is our deliverer in the midst of our trials and our persecutions and our struggles. And it talks about how God will be there whenever we have those struggles and we have those difficulties. He will be there and He will deliver us. It says, the name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous run into it and are safe. The name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous run into it and are safe. So, in those times of difficulties, in those times of persecution, in those times of trials, in those times of hardship, what is the name of the Lord? The name of the Lord is a strong tower. What do the righteous do? They run into it and are safe. What did God do for Paul? God sent a deliverer. God delivered Paul from whom? The crowd that were seeking to do what? They were seeking to beat him and to take his life. And the reality was that God knows His children. God knows their struggles. And God will send a deliverer in some shape or form. And God will be the one who spares and takes care of His people. Well, let's go on, verses 37 and 38. Based on the commander's conversation with Paul, the commander now understands that Paul's not a leader of a rebellion. The Jews have portrayed. The Jews have portrayed Paul as being one who was a leader of the rebellion. When the reality was, the commander now ascertained, he understood now that Paul was not a leader of the rebellion. Paul was not a leader of someone doing something against the Roman government, someone doing something against the cause of all this riot. He understood that Paul wasn't this person. And the reality was that Paul used wisdom. He used wisdom here. He says, may I speak to you? And then the commander understood that the reality is that the commander was trying to find out who Paul was, and the reality, what Paul was saying is, I'm not this rebellious man. Paul used wisdom as he was speaking to the commander. And the commander now understood. So what did that do? That found favor with the commander of Paul. He wasn't a leader of a rebellion. And the commander was understanding that, hey, there's something going on here that Paul didn't do, but these other people did. And so they're finding out that the accusations against Paul and what was happening with the whole, all this riot that was going on in the city wasn't because of Paul, but was because of people stirring up the crowd. And it goes on here, it says, in verses 39 and 40, Paul is able to clarify who he is. Paul asks permission to speak to the crowd, is granted permission to talk to the crowd. God's protection and His favor. And there's a great hush as Paul speaks. In other words, not only did, once the commander found out who Paul was and that what Paul was about, the commander even gave permission to Paul to do what? To speak to the crowd. The reality was that the commander had any thought or any idea about Paul being a leader of a rebellion, he wouldn't have let Paul do that. But he found favor with Paul. Paul found favor with the commander. But that was all because of God. God protecting Paul, God caring for Paul. And it goes on here and it says, as Paul speaks, he motions with his hand, and what happens to the people? There is a great hush. that came over the crowd. There was a great hush that came over all the people. God had granted Paul favor. People will always try and make accusations that are often unfounded and baseless. We can't always allow this to deter us. We need to find courage in the Lord. Often when people do that, people are going to do that in life. And people are going to happen in life. As Christians and as people are going to say things that are going to hurt us. People are going to make accusations that are going to try and harm us. But we can't allow those things to deter us from doing what God has called us to do. And being the Christians and being the people that God's called us to be. We cannot allow that to happen. But what do we have to do in those moments? And we have to find courage where? In who? In the Lord. As often as David did. David, if you look at Psalms, and I will refer you to Psalms, David often found courage in the Lord. He found his strength in the Lord. It didn't deter him from doing what God had told him to do, because God had told him he would be king. But that didn't deter him or discourage him, but he would find strength and find courage in God. And that's what we need to do as when we face trials and difficulties, when people say things and do things against us that are going to harm us and hurt us. We can't give up. And sometimes what happens is we'll capitulate, we'll give in, and we'll go into our shell, and it'll take us out. And we'll get all disillusioned and get hurt. And often people will leave the church or leave Christianity or leave their faith because of what someone else said or what someone else was doing. And the reality is we can't do that. We have to do what? We have to find our courage, and we have to find our strength in whom? In the Lord. Remember, Proverbs 18:10. The name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous run into it, and are what? And are safe. People will try to persecute us in some way. We must continue to trust Him and press on. People are going to try and do it. And in life, people can be hurtful, aren't they? Can't they? They can be hurtful if they want to. They can use words, they can use other means to hurt us and to harm us. But we can't allow that, again, to deter us, but we must continue to trust God, and we must continue to press on in our faith. We can't let those things, those accusations, and those hurts, and those things that people impose on us to deter us from doing what God's called us to do. And then lastly, it says, know that God will send deliverance and protection in some form or way. And we need to use wisdom as Paul did. Again, know that God is your deliverer, and He is your what? He is your protector. Just like He did with Paul, God delivered Paul when people were trying to kill him. God protected Paul, and God always did that throughout Paul's life. And Paul, because God had a purpose and a plan for Paul, but also God loved Paul, and Paul was God's child, and God wanted to protect him. Same thing with us. God loves us. He cares for us, and He has a purpose and a plan for us, and He wants to see that purpose and that plan accomplished. And it's not going to be deterred by what? By others trying to hurt us or harm us, or others trying to persecute us, or others trying to do things against us, to do things against the Lord. So we need to continue to persevere, trust the Lord, and continue to look to Him to find our courage and strength and press on in the Lord. Amen.